Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to our next part of the chapter of Good Omens that we are in right now, Chapter 6. Oh boy, I did not prepare this one before I started it. So we are still going through Chapter 6. I imagine that we'll be in here for at least 2 more sittings, if not more, and I'm thinking that the 2 sittings are probably going to be... they're probably going to be it for this week, mainly because I'm taking some vacation time from work a little bit this week, and so I won't be planning on doing any readings over that time, probably. But when I get back, then it's just the into the home stretch of the book. We're getting pretty close to the end here. I would think that, as I said, probably 3 sittings at least will get us through. But we'll see how far we get going forward. I anticipate getting mostly through the rest of Chapter 6 this evening, if not all of it. But we'll see. So we're going to hop back into it. And where we're at right now is basically everyone is kind of converging on the military base outside of Tadfield at the moment. It's more of a glorified airfield to the knowledge of the people of Tadfield, but pretty much everybody's going there. The 4 bikers of the apocalypse, Adam and the Them, Crowley, Aziraphale, Sergeant Shadwell, Newt, Anathema, they're all heading this direction. So as we continue in this vein, we're going to keep going with the next section here. Here we go. R.P. Tyler had composed a lengthy mental letter on the failings of the youth of today. It covered falling educational standards, the lack of respect given to your elders and betters, the way they always seem to slouch these days instead of walking with a proper upright bearing, juvenile delinquency, the return of compulsory national service, birching, flogging, and dog licenses. He was very satisfied with it. He had a sneaking suspicion that it would be too good for the Tadfield Advertiser, and had decided to send it to the Times. Put. "Excuse me, love," said a warm female voice. "I think we're lost." It was an aging motor scooter, and it was being ridden by a middle-aged woman. Clutching her tightly, his eyes screwed shut, was a rain-coated little man with a bright green crash helmet on. Sticking up between them was what appeared to be an antique gun with a funnel-shaped muzzle. "Oh, where are you going?" "Lower Tadfield. I'm not sure of the exact address, but we're looking for someone," said the woman. Then, in a totally different voice, she said, "His name is Adam Young." R.P. Tyler boggled. "You want that boy?" he asked. "What's he done now?" No, don't tell me. I don't want to know." "Boy?" said the woman. "You didn't tell me he was a boy. How old is he?" Then she said, "He's 11. Well, I do wish you'd mentioned this before. It puts a completely different complexion on things." R.P. Tyler just stared. Then he realized what was going on. The woman was a ventriloquist. What he had taken for a man in a green crash helmet, he now saw, was a ventriloquist dummy. He wondered how he could ever have assumed it was human. He felt the whole thing was in vaguely bad taste. "I saw Adam Young not 5 minutes ago," he told the woman. "He and his little cronies were on their way to the American Air Base." "Oh dear," said the woman, paling slightly. "I've never really liked the Yanks. They're really very nice people, you know." "Yes, but you can't trust people who pick up the ball all the time when they play football." "Ah, excuse me," said R.P. Tyler. "I think it's very good, very impressive. I'm deputy chairman of the local Rotary Club, and I was wondering, do you do any private functions?" "Only on Thursdays," said Madame Tracy disapprovingly. "And I charge extra." "And I wonder if you could direct us to—" Mr. Tyler had been here before. He wordlessly extended a finger, and the little scooter went put down the narrow country lane. As it did so, the gray dummy in the green helmet turned round and opened one eye. "You great southern pillock!" it croaked. R.P. Tyler was offended, but also disappointed. He'd hoped it would be more lifelike. R.P. Tyler, only 10 minutes away from the village, paused while Schutze attempted another of its wide range of eliminatory functions. He gazed over the fence. His knowledge of country lore was a little hazy, but he felt fairly sure that if the cows lay down, it meant rain. If they were standing, it would probably be fine. These cows were taking it in turns to execute slow and solemn somersaults, and Tyler wondered what it presaged for the weather. He sniffed. Something was burning. There was an unpleasant smell of scorched metal and rubber and leather. "Excuse me," said a voice from behind him. R.P. Tyler turned around. There was a large, once black car on fire in the lane, and a man in sunglasses was leaning out of one window, saying through the smoke, "I'm sorry, I've managed to get a little lost. Can you direct me to Lower Tadfield Air Base? I know it's around here somewhere." "Your car is on fire." No, Tyler just couldn't bring himself to say it. I mean, the man had to know that, didn't he? He was sitting in the middle of it. Possibly it was some kind of practical joke. So instead he said, "I think you must have taken a wrong turn about a mile back. A signpost is blown down." The stranger smiled. "That must be it," he said. The orange flames flickering below him gave him an almost infernal appearance. The wind blew towards Tyler, across the car, and he felt his eyebrows frizzle. "Excuse me, young man, but your car is on fire and you're sitting in it without burning, and incidentally it's red hot in places." No. Should he ask the man if he wanted him to phone the AA? Instead, he explained the route carefully, trying not to stare. "That's terrific. Much obliged," said Crowley as he began to wind up the window. R.P. Tyler had to say something. "Excuse me, young man," he said. "Yes? I mean, it's not the kind of thing you don't notice, your car being on fire." A tongue of flame licked across the charred dashboard. "Funny weather we're having, isn't it?" he said lamely. "Is it?" said Crowley. "I honestly hadn't noticed." And he reversed back down the country lane in his burning car. "That's probably because your car is on fire," said R.P. Tyler sharply. He jerked Schutzie's lead, dragging the dog to heel. "To the editor. Sir, I would like to draw your attention to a recent tendency I have noticed for today's young people to ignore perfectly sensible safety precautions while driving. This evening I was asked for directions by a gentleman whose car was... No. Driving a car that... No. It was on fire!" His temper getting worse, R.P. Tyler stomped the final stretch back into the village. "Oi!" shouted R.P. Tyler. "Young!" Mr. Young was in his front garden, sitting on his deck chair, smoking his pipe. This had more to do with Deirdre's recent discovery of the menace of passive smoking and banning of smoking in the house than he would care to admit to his neighbors. It did not improve his temper. Neither did being addressed as young by Mr. Tyler. "Yes?" "Your son, Adam." Mr. Young sighed. "What's he done now?" "Do you know where he is?" Mr. Young checked his watch. "Getting ready for bed, I would assume." Tyler grinned, tightly, triumphantly. "I doubt it. I saw him and his little fiends and that appalling mongrel not half an hour ago cycling towards the airbase." Mr. Young puffed on his pipe. "You know how strict they are up there," said Mr. Tyler, in case Mr. Young hadn't gotten the message. "You know what a one your son is for pressing buttons and things," he added. Mr. Young took his pipe out of his mouth and examined the stem thoughtfully. He said. "I see," he said. "Right," he said, and he went inside. At exactly that same moment, 4 motorbikes swished to a halt a few hundred yards from the main gate. The riders switched off their engines and raised their helmet visors. Well, 3 of them did. "I was rather hoping we could crash through the barriers," said War wistfully. "That'd only cause trouble," said Famine. "Good. Trouble for us, I mean. The power and phone lines must be down, but they're bound to have generators, and they'll certainly have radio. If someone starts reporting that terrorists have invaded the base, then people will start acting logically, and the whole plan collapses." "We go in, we do the job. We go out, we let human nature take its course," said Death. "This isn't how I imagined it, chaps," said War. "I haven't been waiting for thousands of years just to fiddle around with bits of wire. It's not what you'd call dramatic. Albrecht Dürer didn't waste his time doing woodcuts of the 4 button presses of the apocalypse. I do know that." "I thought there'd be trumpets," said Pollution. "Look at it like this," said Famine. "It's just groundwork. We get to do the riding forth afterwards, the proper riding forth. Wings of the storm and so on. You've got to be flexible." "Weren't we supposed to meet Someone, said War. There was no sound but the metallic noises of cooling motorbike engines. Then Pollution said, slowly, I can't say I imagined it'd be somewhere like this, either. I thought it'd be, well, a big city, or a big country. New York, perhaps, or Moscow, or Armageddon itself. There was another pause. Then War said, Where is Armageddon, anyway? Funny you should ask, said Famine. I've always meant to look it up. There's an Armageddon, Pennsylvania, said Pollution. Or maybe it's Massachusetts or one of them places. Lots of guys in heavy beards and seriously black hats. Nah, said Famine. It's somewhere in Israel, I think. Mount Carmel. I thought that was where they grow avocados. And the end of the world. Is that right? That's one big avocado. I think I went there once, said Pollution. The old city of Megiddo, just before it fell down. Nice place. Interesting royal gateway. War looked at the greenness around them. Boy, she said, did we take a wrong turning? The geography is immaterial. Sorry, Lord? If Armageddon is anywhere, it is everywhere. That's right, said Famine. We're not talking about a few square miles of scrub and goats anymore. There was another pause. Let us go. War coughed. It's just that I thought that he'd be coming with us. Death adjusted his gauntlets. This, he said firmly, is a job for the professionals. Afterwards, Sergeant Thomas A. Deisenburger recalled events at the gate as having happened like this. A large staff car drew up by the gate. It was sleek and official-looking, although afterwards he wasn't entirely sure why he had thought this, or why it sounded momentarily as though it were powered by motorbike engines. 4 generals got out. Again, the sergeant was a little uncertain of why he had thought this. They had proper identification. What kind of identification, admittedly, he couldn't quite recall, but it was proper. He saluted. And one of them said, Surprise inspection, soldier. To which Sergeant Thomas A. Deisenburger replied, Sir, I have not been informed as to the incidence of a surprise inspection at this time, sir. Of course not, said one of the generals. That's because it's a surprise. The sergeant saluted again. Sir, permission to confirmate this intelligence with base command, sir, he said uneasily. The tallest and thinnest of the generals strolled a little way from the group, turned his back, and folded his arms. One of the others put a friendly arm around the sergeant's shoulders and leaned forward in a conspiratorial way. Now see here. He squinted at the sergeant's name tag. Deisenburger. Maybe I'll give you a break. It's a surprise inspection. Got that? Surprise. That means no getting on the horn the moment we've gone through, understand? And no leaving your post. Career soldier like you will understand, am I right? He added. He winked. Otherwise, you'd find yourself busted so low you'd have to say sir to an imp. Sergeant Thomas A. Deisenburger stared at him. Private, hissed one of the other generals. According to her tag, her name was Wah. Sergeant Deisenburger had never seen a female general like her before, but she was certainly an improvement. What? Private, not imp. Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah, private. Okay, soldier. The sergeant considered the very limited number of options at his disposal. Sir, surprise inspection, sir. Provisionatedly classificisioned at this time, said Famine, who had spent years learning how to sell to the federal government and could feel the language coming back to him. Sir, affirmative, sir, said the sergeant. Good man, said Famine as the barrier was raised. You'll go a long way. He glanced at his watch. Very shortly. Sometimes human beings are very much like bees. Bees are fiercely protective of their hive, provided you are outside it. Once you're in, the workers sort of assume that it must have been cleared by management and take no notice. Various freeloading insects have evolved a mellifluous existence because of this very fact. Humans act the same way. No one stopped the 4 as they purposefully made their way into one of the long, low buildings under the forest of radio masts. No one paid any attention to them. Perhaps they saw nothing at all. Perhaps they saw what their minds were instructed to see. because the human brain is not equipped to see war, famine, pollution, and death when they don't want to be seen, and has got so good at not seeing that it often manages not to see them even when they abound on every side. The alarms were totally brainless and thought they saw 4 people where people shouldn't be, and went off like anything. Newt did not smoke because he did not allow nicotine to gain entry into the temple of his body, or, more accurately, the small Welsh Methodist tin tabernacle of his body. If he had been a smoker, he would have choked on the cigarette that he would have been smoking at this time in order to steady his nerves. Anathema stood up purposefully and smoothed the creases in her skirt. "Don't worry," she said. "They don't apply to us. Something's probably happening inside." She smiled at his pale face. "Come on," she said. "It's not the OK Corral." "No, they've got better guns, for one thing," said Newt. She helped him up. "Never mind," she said. "I'm sure you'll think of a way." It was inevitable that all 4 of them couldn't contribute equally, War thought. She'd been surprised at her natural affinity for modern weapon systems, which were so much more efficient than bits of sharp metal, and of course Pollution laughed at absolutely foolproof, fail-safe devices. Even Famine at least knew what computers were. Whereas, well, he didn't do anything much except hang around, although he did it with a certain style. It had occurred to War that there might one day be an end to war, an end to famine, possibly even an end to pollution, and perhaps this was why the 4th and greatest horseman was never exactly what you might call one of the lads. It was like having a tax inspector on your football team. Great to have him on your side, of course, but not the kind of person you wanted to have a drink with and chat with in the bar afterwards. You couldn't be 100% at your ease. A couple of soldiers ran through him as he looked over Pollution's skinny shoulder. "What are those glittery things?" he said, in the tones of one who knows he won't be able to understand the answer but wants to be seen to be taking an interest. 7-segment LED displays, said the boy. He laid loving hands on a bank of relays which fused under his touch, and then introduced a swath of self-replicating viruses that whirred away on the electronic ether. "I really could do without those bloody alarms," muttered Famine. Death absent-mindedly snapped his fingers. A dozen klaxons gurgled and died. "I don't know. I rather like them," said Pollution. War reached inside another metal cabinet. This wasn't the way she'd expected things to be, she had to admit, but when she ran her fingers over and sometimes through the electronics, there was a familiar feel. It was an echo of what you got when you held a sword, and she felt a thrill of anticipation at the thought that this sword enclosed the whole world, and a certain amount of the sky above it as well. It loved her. A flaming sword. Mankind had been very good at learning that swords are dangerous if left lying around, although it had done its limited best to make sure that the chances of one this size being wielded accidentally were high. A cheering thought, that. It was nice to think that mankind made a distinction between blowing their planet to bits by accident and doing it by design. Pollution plunged his hands into another rack of expensive electronics. The guard on the hole in the fence looked puzzled. He was aware of excitement back in the base, and his radio seemed to be picking up nothing but static, and his eyes were being drawn again and again to the card in front of him. He'd seen many identity cards in his time, military, CIA, FBI, KGB even, and being a young soldier had yet to grasp that the more insignificant an organization is, the more impressive are its identity cards. This one was hellishly impressive. His lips moved as he read it again, all the way from "The Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of Britain charges and demands," though the bit about commandeering all kindling, rope, and igniferous oils, right down to the signature of the WA's First Lord Adjutant, "Praise him all ye works of the Lord, and fly fornication Smith." Newt kept his thumb over the bit about 9 pence per witch and tried to look like James Bond. Finally, the guard's probing intellect found a word he thought he recognized. "What's this here?" he said suspiciously. "About us gotta give you faggots." "Oh, we have to have them," said Newt. "We burn them." "Say what?" "We burn them." The guard's face broadened into a grin, and they told him England was soft. "Right on," he said. Something pressed into the small of his back. "Drop your gun," said Anathema behind him, "or I shall regret what I shall have to do next." Well, it's true, she thought as she saw the man stiffen in horror. If he doesn't drop the gun, he'll find out this is a stick, and I shall really regret having to be shot. At the main gate, Sergeant Thomas A. Deisenburger was also having problems. A little man in a dirty mac kept pointing a finger at him and muttering, while a lady who looked slightly like his mother talked to him in urgent tones and kept interrupting herself in a different voice. "It really is vitally important that we are allowed to speak to whoever is in charge," said Aziraphale. "I really must ask that—" "He's right, you know. I'd be able to tell if he was lying." "Yes, thank you. I think we'd really achieve something if you kindly allowed me to carry on." "All right, thank you. I was only trying to put in a good word." "Yes! You were asking him to—" "Yes, all right. Now—" "D'ye see my finger?" shouted Shadwell, whose sanity was still attached to him, but only on the end of a long and rather frayed string. "D'ye see it? This finger, laddie, could send you to meet your maker." Sergeant Deisenburger stared at the black and purple nail a few inches from his face. As an offensive weapon, it rated quite highly, especially if it was ever used in the preparation of food. The telephone gave him nothing but static. He'd been told not to leave his post. His wound from Nam was starting to play up. He'd slipped and fallen in a hotel shower when he took a holiday there in 1983. Now the mere sight of a bar of yellow soap could send him into near-fatal flashbacks. He wondered how much trouble he could get into for shooting non-American civilians. The 4 bicycles pulled up a little way from the base. Tire marks in the dust and a patch of oil indicated that other travelers had briefly rested there. "What are we stopping for?" said Pepper. "I'm thinking," said Adam. It was hard. The bit of his mind that he knew as himself was still there, but he was trying to stay afloat on a fountain of tumultuous darkness. What he was aware of, though, was that his 3 companions were 100% human. He'd got them into trouble before in the way of torn clothes, docked pocket money, and so on, but this one was almost certainly going to involve a lot more than being confined to the house and made to tidy up your room. On the other hand, there wasn't anyone else. "All right," he said. "We need some stuff, I think. We need a sword, a crown, and some scales." They stared at him. "What, just here?" said Brian. "There's nothing like that here." "I don't know," said Adam. "When you think about the games and that, we've played." Just to make Sergeant Deisenburger's day, a car pulled up and it was floating several inches off the ground because it had no tires. Or paintwork. What it did have was a trail of blue smoke, and when it stopped, it made the pinging noises made by metal cooling down from a very high temperature. It looked as if it had smoked glass windows, although this was just an effect caused by it having ordinary glass windows but a smoke-filled interior. The driver's door opened, and a cloud of choking fumes got out. Then Crowley followed it. He waved the smoke away from his face, blinked, and then turned his gesture into a friendly wave. "Hi," he said. "How's it going? Has the world ended yet?" "He won't let us in, Crowley," said Madame Tracy. "Aziraphale, is that you?" "Nice dress," said Crowley vaguely. He wasn't feeling very well. For the last 30 miles, he had been imagining that a ton of burning metal, rubber, and leather was a fully functioning automobile, and the Bentley had been resisting him fiercely. The hard part had been to keep the whole thing rolling after the all-weather radials had burned away. Beside him, the remains of the Bentley dropped suddenly onto its distorted wheel rims as he stopped imagining that it had tires. He patted a metal surface hot enough to fry eggs on. "You wouldn't get that sort of performance out of these modern cars," he said lovingly. They stared at him. There was a little electronic click. The gate was rising. The housing that contained the electronic motor gave a mechanical groan, and then gave up in the face of the unstoppable force acting on the barrier. "Hey!" said Sergeant Deisenburger. "Which one of you yo-yos did that?" Zip, 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 and a small dog, its legs a blur. They stared at the 4 ferociously pedaling figures that ducked under the barrier and disappeared into the camp. The sergeant pulled himself together. "Hey," he said, but much more weakly this time. "Did any of them kids have some space alien with a face like a friendly turd in a bike basket?" "Don't think so," said Crowley. "Then," said Sergeant Deisenburger, "they're in real trouble." He raised his gun. Enough of this pussyfooting around. He kept thinking of soap. "And so," he said, you." "I warned ye," Shadwell began. "This has gone on too long," said Aziraphale. "Sort it out, Crowley, there's a dear chap." "Hmm?" said Crowley. I'm the nice one, said Aziraphale. You can't expect me to... Oh, blast it! You tried to do the decent thing, and where does it get you? He snapped his fingers. There was a pop like an old-fashioned flashbulb, and Sergeant Thomas A. Deisenburger disappeared. Said Aziraphale. See? Said Shadwell, who hadn't quite got the hang of Madame Tracy's split personality. Nothing to it. You stick by me, you'll be all right. Well done, said Crowley. Never thought you had it in you. No, said Aziraphale. Nor did I, in fact. I do hope I haven't sent him somewhere dreadful. You better get used to it right now, said Crowley. You just send 'em. Best not to worry about where they go. He looked fascinated. Aren't you going to introduce me to your new body? Oh, yes, of course. Madame Tracy, this is Crowley. Crowley, Madame Tracy. Charmed, I'm sure. Let's get on in, said Crowley. He looked sadly at the wreckage of the Bentley, and then brightened. A jeep was heading purposefully towards the gate, and it looked as though it was crowded with people who were about to shout questions and fire guns and not worry about which order they did this in. He brightened up. This was more what you might call his area of competence. He took his hands out of his pockets and raised them like Bruce Lee, and then he smiled like Lee Van Cleef. Ah, he said. Here comes transport. They parked their bikes outside one of the low buildings. Wensleydale carefully locked his. He was that kind of boy. So what will these people look like? Said Pepper. They can look like all sorts, said Adam doubtfully. They're grown-ups, are they? Said Pepper. Yes, said Adam. More grown-up than you've ever seen before, I reckon. Fighting grown-ups is never any use, said Wensleydale gloomily. You always get into trouble. You don't have to fight 'em, said Adam. You just do what I told you. The them looked at the things they were carrying. As far as tools to mend the world were concerned, they did not look incredibly efficient. How will we find them, then? Said Brian, doubtfully. I remember when we came to the open day. It's all rooms and stuff. Lots of rooms and flashing lights. Adam just stared thoughtfully at the buildings. The alarms were still yodeling. Well, he said, it seems to me... Hey, what are you kids doing here? It wasn't 100% threatening voice, but it was near the end of its tether, and it belonged to an officer who'd spent 10 minutes trying to make sense of a senseless world where alarms went off and doors didn't open. Two equally harassed soldiers stood behind him, clearly at a loss as to how to deal with 4 short and clearly Caucasian juveniles, one of them marginally female. Don't you worry about us, said Adam airily. We're just looking around. Now you just... the lieutenant began. Go to sleep, said Adam. You just all go to sleep. All you soldiers here go to sleep. Then you won't get hurt. You all just go to sleep. Now. The lieutenant stared at him, his eyes trying to focus. Then he pitched forward. Coo, said Pepper as the others collapsed. How'd you do that? Well, said Adam cautiously, you know that bit about hypnotism in the boy's own book of 101 Things to Do that we can never make work? Yes? Well, it's sort of like that, only now I've found out how to do it. He turned back to the communications building. He pulled himself together, his body unfolding from its habitual comfortable slouch into an upright bearing Mr. Tyler would have been proud of. Right, he said. He thought for a while. Then he said, come and see. If you took the world away and just left the electricity, it would be like the most exquisite filigree ever made. A ball of twinkling silver lines, with the occasional coruscating spike of a satellite beam. Even the dark areas would glow with radar and commercial radio waves. It could be the nervous system of a great beast. Here and there, cities make knots in the web, but most of the electricity, as it were, mere musculature, concerned only with crude work. But for 50 years or so, people had been giving electricity brains. And now it was alive, in the same way that fire is alive. Switches were welding shut, relays fused. In the heart of silicon chips, where microscopic architecture looked like a street plan of Los Angeles, fresh pathways opened up, and hundreds of miles away, bells rang in underground rooms, and men stared in horror at what certain screens were telling them. Heavy steel doors shut firmly in secret hollow mountains, leaving people on the other side to pound on them and wrestle with fuse boxes which had melted. Bits of desert and tundra slid aside, letting fresh air into air-conditioned tombs, and blunt shapes ground ponderously into position. And while it flowed where it should not, it ebbed from its normal beds. In cities, the traffic lights went, and the street lights, then all the lights. Cooling fans slowed, flickered, and stopped. Heaters faded into darkness. Lifts stuck. Radio stations choked off, their soothing music silenced. It has been said that civilization is 24 hours and 2 meals away from barbarism. Night was spreading slowly around the spinning earth. It should have been full of pinpricks of light. It was not. There were 5 billion people down there. What was going to happen soon would make barbarism look like a picnic. Hot, nasty, and eventually given over to the ants. Death straightened up. He appeared to be listening intently. It was anyone's guess to what he listened with. "He is here," he said. The other 3 looked up. There was a barely perceptible change in the way they stood there. A moment before Death had spoken, they, the part of them that did not walk and talk like human beings, had been wrapped around the world. Now they were back. More or less. There was a strangeness about them. It was as if, instead of ill-fitting suits, they now had ill-fitting bodies. Famine looked as though he had been tuned slightly off station, so that the hitherto dominant signal of a pleasant, thrusting, successful businessman was beginning to be drowned out by the ancient, horrible static of his basic personality. War's skin glistened with sweat. Pollution's skin just glistened. "It's all taken care of," said War, speaking with some effort. "It'll take its course." "It's not just the nuclear," Pollution said. "It's the chemical. Thousands of gallons of stuff in little tanks all over the world. Beautiful liquids, with 18 syllables in their names. And the old standbys. Say what you like. Plutonium is forever. It may give you grief for thousands of years, but arsenic is forever." "And then, winter," said Famine. "I like winter. There's something clean about winter." "Chickens coming home to roost," said War. "No more chickens," said Famine, flatly. Only Death hadn't changed. Some things don't. The 4 left the building. It was noticeable that Pollution, while still walking, nevertheless gave the impression of oozing. And this was noticed by Anathema and Newton Pulsifer. It had been the first building they'd come to. It had seemed much safer inside than out, where there seemed to be a lot of excitement. Anathema had pushed open a door covered in signs that suggested that this would be a terminally dangerous thing to do. It had swung open at her touch. When they had gone inside, it had shut and locked itself. There hadn't been a lot of time to discuss this after the 4 had walked in. "What were they?" said Newt. "Some kind of terrorists?" "In a very nice and accurate sense," said Anathema. "I think you're right." "What was all that weird talk about?" "I think possibly the end of the world," said Anathema. "Did you see their auras?" "I don't think so," said Newt. "Not nice at all." "Oh." "Negative auras, in fact." "Oh?" "Like black holes." "That's bad, is it?" "Yes." Anathema glared at the rows of metal cabinets. For once, just now, because it wasn't just for play, but was for real, the machinery that was going to bring about the end of the world, or at least that part of it that occupied the layers between about 2 meters down and all the way to the ozone layer, wasn't operating according to the usual script. There were no big red canisters with flashing lights. There were no coiled wires with a cut-me look about them. No suspiciously large numeric displays were counting down toward a 0 that could be averted with seconds to spare. Instead, the metal cabinets looked solid and heavy, and very resistant to last-minute heroism. "What takes its course?" said Anathema. "They've done something, haven't they?" "Perhaps there's an off switch," said Newt helplessly. "I'm sure if we looked around—" "These sorts of things are wired in. Don't be silly. I thought you knew about this sort of thing." Newt nodded desperately. This was a long way from the pages of easy electronics. For the look of the thing, he peered into the back of one of the cabinets. Worldwide communications, he said indistinctly. You could do practically anything. Modulate the main's power, tap into satellites, absolutely anything. You could... make things do... just about... Ooh. How are you getting on in there? Newt sucked his fingers. So far, he hadn't found anything that resembled a transistor. He wrapped his hand in his handkerchief and pulled a couple of boards out of their sockets. Once, one of the electronics magazines to which he subscribed had published a joke circuit which was guaranteed not to work. At last, they'd said in an amusing way, here's something all you ham-fisted hams out there can build in the certain knowledge that if it does nothing, it's working. It had diodes the wrong way round, transistors upside down, and a flat battery. Newt had built it, and had picked up Radio Moscow. He'd written them a letter of complaint, but they never replied. I really don't know if I'm doing any good, he said. James Bond just unscrews things, said Anathema. Not just unscrews, said Newt, his temper fraying. And I'm not James Bond. If I was, the bad guys would have shown me all the Megadeth levers and told me how they bloody well worked, wouldn't they? Only it doesn't happen like that in real life. I don't know what's happening, and I can't stop it. Clouds churned around the horizon. Overhead, the sky was still clear, the air torn by nothing more than a light breeze. But it wasn't normal air. It had a crystallized look to it, so that you might feel that if you turned your head, you might see new facets. It sparkled. If you had to find a word to describe it, the word thronged might slip insidiously into your mind. Thronged with insubstantial beings awaiting only the right moment to become very substantial. Adam glanced up. In one sense, there was just clear air overhead. In another, stretching off to infinity, were the hosts of heaven and hell, wingtip to wingtip. If you looked really closely and had been specially trained, you could tell the difference. Silence held the bubble of the world in its grip. The door of the building swung open, and the four stepped out. There was no more than a hint of human about three of them now. They seemed to be humanoid shapes made up of the things they were or represented. They made death seem positively homely. His leather greatcoat and dark-visored helmet had become a cowled robe, but these were mere details. A skeleton, even a walking one, is at least human. Death of a sort lurks inside every living creature. The thing is, said Adam urgently, they're not really real. They're just like nightmares, really. But we're not asleep, said Pepper. Dog whined and tried to hide behind Adam. That one looks as if he's melting, said Brian, pointing to the advancing figure, if such it could still be called, of pollution. There you are, then, said Adam, encouragingly. It can't be real, can it? It's common sense. Something like that can't be really real. The four halted a few meters away. It has been done, said Death. He leaned forward a little and stared eyelessly at Adam. It was hard to tell if he was surprised. Yes, well, said Adam. The thing is, I don't want it done. I never asked for it to be done. Death looked at the other three and then back at Adam. Behind them, a jeep skewed to a halt. They ignored it. I do not understand, he said. Surely your very existence requires the ending of the world. It is written. I don't see why anyone has to go and write things like that, said Adam calmly. The world is full of all sorts of brilliant stuff, and I haven't found out all about it yet, and I don't want anyone messing about or ending it before I've had a chance to figure out about it. So you can all just go away. That's the one, Mr. Shadwell, said Aziraphale, his words trailing into uncertainty even as he uttered them. The one with the T-shirt. Death stared at Adam. You are part of us, said War, between teeth like beautiful bullets. It is done. We make the world anew, said Pollution. His voice as insidious as something leaking out of a corroded drum into a water table. You lead us, said Famine, and Adam hesitated. Voices inside him still cried out that this was true, and that the world was his as well, and all he had to do was turn and lead them out across a bewildered planet. They were his kind of people. In tiers above, the hosts of the sky waited for the word. You cannot want me to shoot him, he's but a bairn! Said Aziraphale. Yes, perhaps we just better wait a bit. What do you think? Until he grows up, do you mean? Said Crowley. Dog began to growl. Adam looked at the them. They were his kind of people, too. You just had to decide who your friends really were. He turned back to the four. Get them, said Adam, quietly. The slouch and slur was gone from his voice. It had strange harmonics. No one human could disobey a voice like that. War laughed and looked expectantly at the them. Little boys, she said, playing with your toys. Think of all the toys I can offer you. Think of all the games. I can make you fall in love with me, little boys. Little boys with your little guns. She laughed again, but the machine gun stutter died away as Pepper stepped forward and raised a trembling arm. It wasn't much of a sword, but it was about the best you could do with 2 bits of wood and a piece of string. War stared at it. I see, she said. Mano a mano, eh? She drew her own blade and brought it up so that it made a noise like a finger being dragged around a wine glass. There was a flash as they connected. Death stared into Adam's eyes. There was a pathetic jingling noise. Don't touch it! Snapped Adam without moving his head. The them stared at the sword rocking to a standstill on the concrete path. Little boys, muttered Pepper disgustedly. Sooner or later everyone has to decide which gang they belong to. Said Brian. She sort of got sucked up the sword. The air between Death and Adam began to vibrate, as in a heat wave. Wensleydale raised his head and looked at Famine in the sunken eye. He knew that something was happening, and with a bit of imagination could be considered to be a pair of scales made of more string and twigs. Then he whirled it around his head. Famine stuck out a protective arm. There was another flash, and the jingle of a pair of silver scales bouncing on the ground. Don't touch them, said Adam. Pollution had already started to run, or at least to flow quickly, but Brian snatched the circle of grass stalks from his own head and flung it. It shouldn't have handled like one, but the force took it out of his hands and it whirred like a discus. This time the explosion was a red flame inside a billow of black smoke, and it smelled of oil. With a rolling, tinny little sound, a blackened silver crown bowled out of the smoke and then spun round with a noise like a settling penny. At least they needed no warning about touching it. It glistened in a way that metal should not. Where'd they go? Said Wensley. Where they belong, said Death, still holding Adam's gaze. Where they have always been, back in the minds of man. He grinned at Adam. There was a tearing sound. Death's robe split, and his wings unfolded. Angels' wings, but not of feathers. They were wings of night, wings that were shapes cut through the matter of creation into the darkness underneath, at which a few distant lights glimmered, lights that may have been stars or may have been something entirely else. But I, he said, am not like them. I am Azrael, created to be creation's shadow. You cannot destroy me. That would destroy the world. The heat of their stare faded. Adam scratched his nose. Oh, I don't know, he said. There might be a way. He grinned back. Anyway, it's going to stop now, he said. All this stuff with the machines. You've got to do what I say just for now, and I say it's got to stop. Death shrugged. It is stopping already, he said. Without them. He indicated the pathetic remnants of the other 3 horse persons. It cannot proceed. Normal entropy triumphs. Death raised a bony hand at what might have been a salute. They'll be back, he said. They're never far away. The wings flapped just once like a thunderclap, and the angel of death vanished. Right then, said Adam to the empty air. All right. It's not going to happen. All the stuff they started, it must stop. Now. And that is where we're going to leave off. We are definitely going to be finishing this chapter tomorrow, and more likely than not, finishing the rest of it in one sitting, I would think. So there we go. 3 more nights of this one. All right, everyone. I hope that you'll come back for the conclusion of the chapter tomorrow, and that you will be back next time for our next little installment. So, until then, everybody stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll be back tomorrow. Night, everyone. See you later.